Hello, everyone. My name is Ramya Marielle El-Agami Khan. I'm the CEO of Orbis Terra Media and the editor-in-chief of Tharawat Magazine. I'm a second generation in my family business and delighted to be on Dov's show today to talk about all the myths around family businesses and their multi-generational success, why we think nepotism can be a good thing under certain circumstances, controversially enough, and how the imposter syndrome can play into how successful a next gen can be within their family business. Stay tuned.
Congratulations! You are tuned into Dov Baron's Leadership and Loyalty Show, the #1 podcast for Fortune 500 executives and those who are dedicated to creating a quantum leap in leadership. Your host, Dov Baron, is the founder of FullMontyLeadership.com. He's an executive mentor to leaders like you, a contributing writer for Entrepreneur Magazine, CEO World, and he's been featured on CNN, Fox, CBS, and many other notable sites. Dov Baron is an international business speaker who was named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers to hire. Now, over to Dov Baron.
Welcome, dear friends, fans, and fellow aficionados of leadership excellence. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Leadership and Loyalty Tips for Executives, part of the Full Monty interview series. I'm your host, Dov Baron. I'm the founder of Full Monty Leadership, and I'm here to assist you tapping into the one thing in your business that changes everything. Let me ask you, do you need to up-level your leadership? Of course you do. Well, today let me ask you, does leadership need to be different if you're dealing with family? Well, you're going to catch this episode to find out. Remember, you can chat about this episode or any past episodes inside of our Facebook and LinkedIn groups. Just look for the Leadership and Loyalty podcast in either of those platforms. If you're a new listener, new viewer, thank you for joining us. Strap yourself in. We're about to go full Monty. As always, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or wherever you tune into podcasts. And we always need your help in staying relevant. So please get over there. Do it now. Tune in and please do me a favor, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. And remember, you can also catch us on traditional radio stations across the United States every Monday and Thursday. And you can also look for us on Roku TV, where there's over 100,000 subscribers. If you're a regular listener, big thank you to you for making us the #1 podcast globally for Fortune 500 listeners with a potential reach of 2.5 to 4 million listeners for every single show. We're honored and grateful to be cited by Inc.com as the #1 podcast to make you a better leader. And you can also catch us at home by going to Google Home or Alexa, just say play Dov Baron podcast. So I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. All right, let's strip it down and dive right in. As a leader, whether you're a CEO, someone in the C-suite, a sales leader, entrepreneur, or leader in any capacity, you've likely heard the term, look, it's not personal, it's just business. Well, what happens when there is no separation between personal and business? You know that being in business can be hard. Being a leader of others, that's a whole other level of challenge. And when you add to that the complications of dealing with family, the challenge might seem insurmountable. But what you may or may not know is that family business is the most frequently encountered ownership business model in the world. It's estimated that the total economic impact of family business to the global GDP, not your country, the global GDP is over 70%. That means that if you're working for an older, more established business, there's a good chance that you're actually working for a family business, even if it doesn't have their name on the wall. However, think about companies like Walmart, Johnson & Johnson, Carnival Cruises, Tata, they make Jags and Land Rovers, Nike, VW, Porsche, Samsung, Roche, and of course, Trump. All those are just names you'd recognize, but they're all family businesses. So how do they do it? How do families not only survive, but thrive in a highly competitive world of business? Well, stay tuned because you're about to find out. My guest on this episode is Ramya Marielle El-Agami Khan. I think I got that right. We'll check in a bit. She is the CEO of Orbis Terra Media, editor-in-chief at Tharawat Magazine, and host of the Family Business Voice podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and welcome Her Royal Highness.
Oh, thank you kindly. Thank you very much for having me.
Good to have you on. Did I get your name right?
Almost. It's actually, It's Ramya Marielle El-Agami Khan. Yes.
Agami. There you go.
Try saying that 10 times fast. I dare you. It'll be
No,
fun.
I refuse to be dead. I'm sorry.
All right.
Because anybody who dares me, it never works out well. You know me. So
True.
let me start here. But this is a part I like to start with all my guests, which is to ask, in a world where everything is out there and we can all be inspired by whoever we're inspired by, but who's somebody who's inspired you? Who's somebody who's had massive impact on you, Ramya, who maybe somebody we wouldn't know or somebody wouldn't suspect that maybe has had influence on your leadership or on how you are as a human being?
Oh, wow. I mean, how much time do we have for this podcast, really? So
if you had to pick someone who's just like,
it's just like, but it's, to be honest with you, it's really like, I always say, because we built a magazine for family businesses, on family businesses over the last 11 years, I have had the big privilege of really, my career has consisted in speaking to phenomenal people over these last 11 years. And I always say, like, whatever I say, whatever opinions I profess, whatever formulations I've come to, is I stand on the shoulders of giants. Because there are so many quiet champions out there that nobody's ever heard of.
Exactly.
That have, that when you interview them or when you talk to them or when you come across these people carrying legacies that have lasted generations forward into another generation, like, you wouldn't believe the strength, the poise, the intelligence, and just the kind of leadership that you come across. So it'd be very hard for me to pinpoint one person in particular. I think it's a type of person really that I've been mostly inspired by. And it's cool. A type of people that I think that, unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not entirely sure whether it's actually a good thing or not, but very few people are ever going to hear about these unsung heroes and what they've done for their businesses and their families and their communities. And it's one of the most beautiful things about our job, really, is that we get to sometimes uncover someone's story that, has never been told before. And that's just it's so powerful, and it's such a privilege, really.
Yeah. I find that, even people who are up front and who are out there, like, obviously I am with what it is that I do, but there's always so much more to people. And I know that you get to do that with your interviews in the magazine. There's so much more to people than what's on the surface. And we so like to see people on the surface and go, oh yeah, well, that's a good person, or that's a bad person. But until you find out the humanity of that person, you don't know the battles and the struggles and what they've gone through. And sometimes it's pretty easy for it to seem insurmountable from the outside, and yet they've done it and done amazing things. And yeah, I love that. I like that you're inspired by that. That's pretty cool. Now you are you're in a family business. You've created a magazine that's a family business. You're the second generation of that business, I believe. Yet, very often with a family business, it has been, we do this, so therefore you do that. It's very much follow the rules. Yet you've had a very entrepreneurial career, and which might seem sort of contradictory to the family business model. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think, and this is actually something, I don't think it just applies to my family necessarily, but I think many family businesses, there's a bit of a misunderstanding around the term and what it means and what kind of business we're actually talking about. Now, family businesses come in all the shapes and sizes, obviously, and like they come in all formats. And very often we define it mainly by the intent of keeping it in family ownership over generations, and there being a long-term strategic outlook towards a business or multiple business activities. So like, there's a lot of adjacent terms that we use around the word family business, enterprising families, business families, family enterprises and stuff. So I think as a whole, it's really about the intent of a family unit to be in business together and investing in enterprises together in whatever shape or form that may be, whether they're operationally active or not, or whether it's just through ownership. So my family, I think my family story is really, and I always say this very lovingly and candidly, we were an accident in that sense. I wish, Dov, I wish in hindsight I could say we planned this. We knew exactly what we were doing, but we didn't. Right. So my parents obvious by the name, we're going to just quickly explain it. My father's Egyptian, my mom's Dutch, and we were born and raised in Switzerland. So I'm the child of immigrants, really, who,
Yep.
like, you know, they did whatever it took, and they did extremely well. My dad built a very successful business in education solutions over the last, that he's been running very successful the last 30 years. And I think, to be honest with you, like, he never built that business with the intent of us coming in as a second generation. His goal was for his kids to have a better life, and, you know, to provide for his family, and to really just make sure that he does something worthwhile. And I think if you'd ask him, not, I don't want to presume and speak on his behalf, but if you'd ask him, I think it was just as much of a surprise for him that we ended up working with him as it was to us. And I think that's also what, for us, of course, in that sense, where we were more flexible than other family businesses tend to be, there wasn't the expectation, and hence there was a certain amount of freedom and creativity involved when we joined the business.
But do you think that that's because you're second generation? Because, you know, we all know the term, anyone who deals with family business, you know it as well, which is shirt sleeve, you know, meaning that by third generation, oftentimes a family business will crash. And part of the reasons that they crash is because by that third generation of rigidity of pushing people into certain roles, a lot of times the younger generation goes, screw you, I don't want to do this, I want to do something else. And your second generation, do you think that that's given you a greater freedom than, I mean, you get to see these families, so do you think it's given you a greater freedom than when you look around at multi-generational family businesses that are 5, 6, 10 generations?
No, I don't think so. I think I think there's always the components of, like, first of all, I want to just say that generally I don't believe in this myth that the third generation destroys it. I'm totally against that statistic. I know where that statistic comes from. There's not been any comprehensive research into this anymore after that one piece of research was done. And I'm actually quite against propagating that statistic, simply for the fact that, of course, there's a high likelihood that the likelihood increases with every generation that it will not be a family business anymore, that the family business closes, is naturally there. But then, you know what the average age is that a business reaches these days on average, even as a non-family business as well. By the third generation, a family business has outdone that average by 3 or 4 times. So we're talking, by the third generation, we're talking a family business that's already over 70, 80, 90 years old, which you've already beaten the odds time and time again. So I'm always a little bit, like, astonished at people actually pointing that out as a huge problem, because, well, yeah, it might be a problem if you wanted it to remain a family business and you didn't succeed because of succession issues and stuff like that. But in reality, if you look at business and how business develops and how industries develop, it might just also be a very natural conclusion to an industry or to a business cycle. And, you know, you never know what the family ends up doing afterwards. So these statistics don't really take into account whether a family moves on to staying in business together in another area, for instance, right? Like, do they move on into a family office? Do they move on into starting a new business together? Like, you know what I mean? Like, so I feel like always that mortality spiel, like, talking about that in such a, like, making it into this sort of like fear of like the third generation, etc. I don't really believe in that. I believe in that there's culture in a family that enables longevity. There's values in a family that enables longevity. And then there is, to be honest with you, also just the sheer business acumen that enables longevity. If you happen to have a generation, and I just spoke to someone about this recently, if you happen to have a generation of family members where you just basically have people who are meant to be employees.
Yep.
And which is totally possible, Dov. Like, you know, you don't have a founder in every generation. You don't have like a visionary or like an extreme doer in every generation. It's not possible. So that might have a huge impact on the continuity of the family business, especially if the family then decides that it is imperative to have a family member in operational roles and doesn't go for outside talent at that point in time, right? So I feel like there's so many factors that influence this, but I always feel like family businesses, we get a bit of a hard like rap, because if you think about it, like we already build businesses that last way longer than the average business without selling it, maintaining jobs in spite of recessions and stuff like that, you know. And I always feel like, okay, let's give the third generation a break, because the fact that you got to the third generation is a pretty big deal, to be honest with you. I think, you know,
I love what you said there, because you've already busted some myths, and I love that. Always love that. because there is always presumptions, and one of the presumptions that, as I said earlier, it's bandied around this shirt sleeve, third generation, etc. But at the same time, very clear point that businesses don't last as long as they did, period. Let's not talk about family business, just business. Businesses that were on the Fortune 500 for 70, 80 years disappeared 15 years ago, and many of them, as late as 2009, literally disappeared and, went away. Some of those were family businesses and some of them were not. So that outliving businesses and the new businesses that have taken over many of the top Fortune 100 companies didn't exist 15 years ago. So there's many factors here, and I think that's a really important piece. And you said something there that I think is in that I want to unpack a little bit, that I think is vital, not just to family business, but to understanding bias around business. And what that is you said that not every generation a founder is born into that generation. Not every generation has that person who is the visionary, the go-getter, etc. And oftentimes the downfall of the business is exactly that we have this bias that it has to be somebody with the family name, from the family, whatever it is, who's got to come in. And the most successful businesses don't do that. Talk to us about, because I know you deal with a lot of this on a regular basis. Talk to us about how you guide those families. When you listen to them, how do you guide them around that very subject, which is, but I want Charlie or I want Susan, or I want whoever it is in the family to step into the role. And that person's like, you know what? I kind of hate the industry. Or you know what? I don't feel like this is for me, or it's not part of my soul. How do you guide them around getting that external help and still holding a family business?
Well, as any family member of a family business will tell you, like you don't do any guiding of others. You just sympathize deeply and you understand where they're coming from. So, I mean, I think what really, this is also like why I love our job in that sense, like the part of what we're doing with the publishing side that is focused on family businesses, because of course we come from a very authentic point of view. So when family members talk to me, I really get it. I know what it's like to work with your parents, with your siblings. I understand,
right.
when the cousins get involved and stuff like that, I get it. And I think that's why we have these interesting conversations where people are quite upfront and honest about how these things make them feel and where it takes them and where the constraints lay. But I think what you just said, there's two things that always strike me very much that people can't underestimate when you're part of a family business. There's this nostalgia. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, nostalgia, you'd think that nostalgia primarily comes from the inside. Like, the family wants to keep it in the family and wants to keep the name alive and preferably primogenitor, like there's a son who will take over and the name continues and stuff like that. But Dov, there's a lot of nostalgia from the outside too. Because consumers and suppliers and a whole community around you is absolutely in love with the idea of there always being a family member at the helm. It means stability, it means continuity, it means satisfying that inherent human need that some things last forever. Right? And I always say, I think one of the big challenges that we maybe don't talk about enough is that family businesses at some point come to the point where they're going to have to disappoint that expectation. And they might actually come to terms with that internally much sooner than the external world might come to terms with it. You know what I mean? So, and this is a little bit the part of where I always say, we tend to romanticize these things, right? We tend to just like we tend to romanticize entrepreneurship as this extreme, this incredible, I don't know, illuminating sort of path. Guys, it's hard work and you have to be incredibly stubborn and you have to sort of have a little bit of hubris to believe that you're going to make it in spite of the odds, right? So that's the reality.
And you're going to be working for $3 an hour for a long time.
Thank you very much. And you know what I mean? And kiss all the status symbols your friends have goodbye and all of that stuff, and it's very interesting, but it's not for everyone. And it's not for every time. And it's not for every industry. And I think my parents are great people. I think they've really, really always dictated pragmatism in their education of us. And I really see that also in other family businesses that have been successful. successful family businesses understand where to draw the line between what is a pragmatic decision for the family, for the business, I would say, for the company, and where do we become like sensitive to the family legacy and the family values that we want to protract across, but beyond the actual activities of the business, basically, like the family's identity that goes beyond that. But I think people they underestimate. Like, I just spoke to a family business that closed down after the fourth generation, and I spoke to the family member who made that decision.
Right.
And he said to me, quite frankly, this was not an interview, this was a private conversation. He said to me, like, quite frankly, the hardest thing was the outside, wasn't the family. The family had come at some point to this inevitable conclusion, look, it's not working anymore.
Right.
But it was the outside world's reaction that made it very hard, because people want these things. They want these fairy tales. They want that stability, they want things to last, because it gives them comfort and gives them stability. And I understand why, but it's just not the reality sometimes. And it means, it might mean you sacrificing people's happiness, a whole generation's happiness, by artificially trying to keep something alive that is meant to move on or take a different shape. So that's where we have to be careful not to romanticize and sort of let that nostalgia dictate ultimately what should be a business decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there we sort of veer off into two separate directions. One is the idea of letting go of something and having a very much business decision around, we maybe need to let this business go, or we need to bring in a new CEO that's from the outside, or new, whatever it is. So that letting go of the tight grip piece, which is not necessarily just family business, but any business. And then the other side of it is the nepotism that I want to talk about it because it's the elephant in the room around family business. And I'm going to say it because it's not supposed to be said and people are not supposed to talk about it, but hey, I'm Dov and I do shit like that. So, obviously the Trump family is a great example of where people are calling out nepotism, because you've got the family members of the Trump family who are not political figures doing political advisory work, and for me, when I look at that and I just think of it in a family business context of, here's somebody underqualified who has bypassed all the normal realm to be able to do what they're doing. And I often wonder, I see these shots or these clips and I wonder, what is that diplomat thinking, or what is that leader thinking when Ivana Trump is in the room, who has no qualifications and who is having these heavy political conversations? And I'm thinking, does that person who may have come up through the ranks feel like, like screaming? So talk to us about, because I know you have some really great insights on this around the nepotism side of it.
Well, I mean, it's a bit of a controversial stance maybe that I have on this, to be honest with you.
That's all right.
That's why you invited me, isn't it? Like,
it is. It absolutely is.
Now I get it. Okay. You want me to contradict everything? Okay, here we go. So I think that, look, nepotism has actually its role in, to a certain extent, in building up a family business, right? Like, so if we look at, I think nepotism has at different stages of the family business life cycle, has a different role to play. So for instance, if you look at it from the founder's perspective, the founder of a legacy, right? Like, who wants to build a business, he's a few years into it, he understands that this is something he'll be able to carry, or she will be able to carry on over decades, not just like the immediate future. It's a very natural thing, Dov, for a lot of people to involve the people they trust the most, which is in most cases the family, right? Like, and actually to a great extent at those early stages, that makes a lot of sense. Because it fortifies the business in its reputation. There's trust, there's fast decision making. There might be just a general acceptance of a definite type of leadership there, right? Like a person that's recognized as the founder and the alpha, and that's all fine. So for that period of time, it might actually work out really well. And it might actually really work out really well in the sense, like, it makes sense to give preference to people you can trust over people who might be able to bring that extra competency to it. But then, of course, businesses are not the same, like, for forever, and they change in their needs. And I think it comes particularly problematic when you want to start attracting the kind of talent that gets you beyond that mom and pop store and that gets you into that league of its own. The moment that you want to start playing with the big boys and girls, it's just the fact that, you need that external talent because you're
Yes.
definitely not going to have it all in the family. It is not physically possible. It's a mathematical improbability that's extremely high, right? That you will have all the talent in the family that you need to get that business to its best state after a certain period of time is impossible. So the moment the family comes to this point where it becomes necessary for us to consider, what do I do to attract the best type of talent from the outside, right? To get this business to the next stage, which in itself is to such a great benefit for the family itself, right? Like that sometimes you wonder why they're resisting it so hard. But of course, there's a lot of, we can talk a little bit about ego, my favorite subject, a lot of ego involved in these things. But I think that when that moment comes, then of course the nepotism side becomes very detrimental. Like, you have, you cannot attract top talent to your company if there's a ceiling and if there's a clear like dysfunctional decision making and communication between family members that will take away the opportunity from those people to do their jobs. Because that's what's happening with Trump and with Ivanka, right? Like in the sense, like she's essentially not, her presence is not allowing the people that are actually in that sphere and are actually like educated to do this kind of work to do their work, because she's interference, if you will. And let's not start talking about the Trumps because that'll take us into a totally different direction. But
no,
like,
but
it's
we're
an
talking about in the
interesting
context. We're talking about in the
of
context
nepotism,
of
right? Like,
family business and nepotism, right? Because
so
Donald Jr. Is running the business side, and Ivanka has her own business, but she's involved in this, and it's like, it's just a very, for me, it's a lovely glaring example.
Well, the other thing to it, though, is that we have to confess one thing. Like, there's that transition where, again, you can't attract top talent when you are always going to give family an advantage over that talent, because they will not stay and they will go to your competition or they will start their own business and you will suffer from it in the short or in the long term, in the long run. But
Yes.
the fact of the matter is, as well, is that even at a later stage in the business, again, I'm referring here to how the consumer perception is, but also how employees feel in a company. There is an inherent feeling of security that comes from family members being present. People associate it with continuity. They associate it with like, oh, the family has our back. So for a lot of companies, it's worked out to always like try to encourage family members to be involved or to take on roles. Whether it's always the best way to go forward in terms of growing the business, it's not necessary. I couldn't scientifically confirm that, but I do know that when it comes sometimes to reinforcing that very special culture that then makes a business last not decades, but centuries, having, and nepotism is a negative term, but let's put it this way, putting an emphasis on involving family members regularly into the business can be a positive thing. Of course, as long as it's clearly communicated why we're doing it and as it is not to the detriment of outside talent. I think it's as simple as that, isn't it? Like,
but there's a piece in here that I think that I really want to bring up with you, because I know you will understand this, that I think is missed. I have experienced this as somebody who works with family businesses, with high net worth family businesses, and is oftentimes I've worked with these second, third generation who maybe dad or granddad was the founder, and the son or the daughter, the eldest individual, actually is treated far worse than an employee.
Yeah, that's much more frequent, by the way.
Yeah, I know. And I think that's why I wanted to address the nepotism thing, right?
Yeah.
Because all things have a polarity, and the polarity of it is, I can think of working with one company where the son was treated awful. He wouldn't even be given the title of CEO, even though he was the CEO. He had to be a senior VP. That was the best title his dad would give him. And his dad spoke to him horribly in board meetings in ways he would not speak to anybody else, because he was his son. And in his dad's mind, I know I had conversations with his dad, in his dad's mind, he was preparing him for the role. And, I was born in a ghetto, and I remember watching their dads beat them and saying, I'm just preparing you for the world. And I know that in that dad's mind, he was actually thinking he was being loving. He was actually being brutal and cruel. And I watched these these founders do that to their children verbally or business wise. So there's
Absolutely.
this other side of nepotism, which I wanted to address, because I think, the obvious, as I said, is the Ivanka Trumps of the world. And you go, oh, well, she's treated so well and she gets to slide through on everything. But let's look at the other side, because I know, as you said, it's more familiar where they are brutalized. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Delv, I find it superb. No, I find it superb that you bring up this point, because I do think that, we have the entitlement discussion way more often than this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact of the matter is if I had to count, I'm pretty sure that I've heard this version of the story about 100 times more than I've heard the entitled version. But the entitlement stories are louder and make more press and make more so negative stories are obviously always like that. Whereas these kind of silent sufferings that happen in the day-to-day of a family business don't often make it to the outside world. And you have to be someone like you who works in the area that you work in to be able to glimpse behind the scenes of these things and to actually witness these conversations. Now, I think that, it's very strange. I think what I've realized, and this also working with my own family, is that it is so strange. Even if you love these people, they're the last people in the world that you want to disappoint. But sometimes they're the last people you would want in that room with you at that moment in time. Because of course, inherently, what it means to have family around the table discussing business, you bring family into a room with you, you bring vulnerability into a room with you. And now people deal with vulnerability in very different ways. Some become extremely defensive and aggressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Others become entitled, whiny, and weepy, right? And then there's a lot of people try to be in the middle somewhere and make it work through communication. But I had to laugh with my sisters. So we're three girls in the second generation. And I had to laugh with my sisters the other day. We did a sisters retreat where it's just us, where we talk about, the future of the business and everything, but just the second generation. And we were talking about our childhood, and we came to the conclusion again that we grew up in the same house. We have the same parents, and we've experienced our childhood completely differently. And so we come into our board meetings every quarter with a totally different level of vulnerability facing certain family members. So that dynamic is incredibly complex, right? And I'm not saying that there's not as much complexity when you deal with people who you're not related to, because the workplace can be a very complicated place. And there's a lot of politics, I'm sure in any organization. But in the family business, I think it hits home so hard. It hits home so much to your core that some people have just used this sort of they almost brutalize their output in order to protect themselves from any kind of revelation of the vulnerability of how much they actually care, how much they care even about what the person actually thinks of them, that they're treating this way. And I think that's the inherent thing, is it depends on how you've been raised to deal with that vulnerability and how you've been raised to communicate around that.
So what's your guidance to that? With, maybe we've got somebody listening, watching, who is in the family business and who is, feeling this polar nepotism, meaning that they're just, they're picked on. They can't be as vulnerable as the other people in the room. They face a much stronger, more harsh backlash than another employee might, who's not inside the family. And maybe, and in fairness, I want to just say this because I think that this is important. They may love their parent. They may not like their parent. They may love their parent. They certainly may not like the way they're being treated, and they may love the parent, and let's pretend they even like being in the business. They just, this is they just don't know where to go, what to do.
Look, I think it starts like anything, and this is a very hard lesson for us all to learn. It starts with yourself, right? Unfortunately, I wish I could say there's a place you can go. There's people. I mean, there are people you can talk to Dov, guys. It's a great way to deal with things. But I think that you have to understand it starts with yourself and with challenging your own perceptions of your family members. Like, what I've learned through a lot of people, but also in my own journey, is that like you can absolutely not make the assumption that you know these people. So these people that you grew up with, or that you're from, or that like however closely related you are to them, making the assumption that you know them and you know every reaction they're going to have and you know what they're like, inherently is the biggest block to you ever changing your position in your situation in the family business. So it is really, because when you come in with that very strong prejudice that you already know that you're going to be shut down, you already know what they're going to say, you already know, you don't understand that you're operating within a self-fulfilling prophecy that the other person can sense. Dov, why would you try and surprise someone with a reaction if you feel like they're not going to believe you anyways, that they don't believe you're capable of change anyways? Why would you try? It's not a very encouraging thing to do. I always tell people, like, it's really reverse psychology, guys. Like, you know, if you want to start being taken seriously, if you want to start like having that conversation, and you know, this is the annoying and mean thing about this, is like very often you will never be able to have that conversation directly with the person who hurts you the most. It is just not possible, at least not to start with. You might eventually get to that point.
Mm-hmm.
But in the moment of intense pain and vulnerability, and where this is happening, the first change is going to happen with yourself, and very likely with the perception of other people around you, which eventually will end up changing that key person's opinion of you. But I think it's about changing patterns and patterns of communication. I know, for instance, that a very successful method that I've employed in my own family business is to consciously reacting in a totally different way than I know they expect of me. Literally.
I love it.
It's a very manipulative, very clear manipulation. And it's a challenge I set myself, where I was thinking like, you know what? I'm not getting anywhere with the way I am communicating. They keep on reacting in this negative way to what I'm saying, and they keep on pushing my buttons. And I thought to myself, like, yeah, people can push your buttons if they know where your buttons are and what those buttons do. So, you know, change the circuits, change the function of the buttons, right? Like, and surprise people with your reactions. And the relief that brings to a relationship that seems to be in the ruts of that pattern, of that negativity, is tremendous. It changes dynamics entirely. And just by you taking the conscious decision, I'm not going to raise to debate, or I'm not going to leave the room at this moment, or I am going to leave the room at this given moment in time and not engage in this conflict. And I think we forget that we have choices.
Yes, absolutely.
About how we react, right? Like, we forget you're not set in a personality that will never allow you to change your circumstances. This is not true.
But most people don't know. Most people don't even consider that. They believe this is who I am. I mean, and that is actually their argument. Well, this is just who I am. No, it's not. It's who you've been, and you can be someone else. And to add to your point, which is the measure of your communication is the results you get, not how good you think you're doing it. If you can, believe me, I am master trained communicator, and every now and then my communication sucks. You just have to ask my wife. and I did not have any intention of being.
Let's get her on the show.
Exactly. I did not have any intention of being a douchebag or saying something terrible, but it's possible, right? Because sometimes it's not a negative intent, but I have to measure, you know, and I can come back at whatever I've gotten with, but I was coming from a good place. But it doesn't matter. The result is, that's my communication is the result. So whatever it is, that's the result of my communication. I have to be responsible for that. And you go, well, you know, you're just too sensitive. Well, no, I have to be sensitive to how somebody will respond. And that takes time. It takes commitment. And as you said, it takes flexibility and agility. And I think that's
why we emphasize also, like, this leads into the argument why we are doing what we're doing in the end in our company as well. Like, why do we emphasize storytelling so much? you have to not forget that the whole reason why families even used to stay together was to gather around stories and storytelling, to transmit them. It's an inherently important thing to do to keep the communication healthy, to understand where we're from, to understand where the previous generation is from, and to inspire the next generation, but to also lead them on a path where they're allowed to define success in a different way, Dov. Like, like someone asked me, what is a successful family business for you a few weeks back? And I just told them, like, a successful family business is a family business that understands that the definition of success will vary from one generation to another, is able to accept that, and is able to grow a business on that. That's a successful family business, not one that's trying to stay in a mold or to stay it's such a strange expression, right? Like, stand the test of time. You're not standing the test of time, guys. You're standing the test of really bad communication. Like, you know what I mean? It's not time, isn't the problem here. It's about how we transmit values. How much effort do we put into transmitting values? See, the power of aligning people around their story, just to agree on their own story.
Yes.
I have, I interview leaders sometimes, and then I have their children come to me and say to me, like, my father, my mother said things to you they've never told me. How sad is that?
Yeah.
To me, a perfect stranger who, it matters, but it doesn't matter as much as it would matter to their children or to their grandchildren to hear this, right? So I think this is where we really need to generally make a bigger effort, and where, I'm sorry, here I'm going to be a little bit biased in favor of the next generation. Let's just not forget, you know what I mean? You cannot expect a young person to understand what it's like to be 30 years ahead in their lives. But as someone who's 30 years ahead in their life, you sure as hell remember what it was like to be young. So don't be a hypocrite about that, because you remember how that felt. You know what I mean? So that direction, it's not about blame, but let's be fair. Like, there is a certain advantage that you have in having lived that, right? Like, in knowing those emotions at that time. And not pretending like you were so different and you don't understand what they're on about. Like, come on. Right. It's just not right.
But again, coming back to that piece, you and I talked about this when I was on your show, and I've written about it a lot, as you know, which is imposter syndrome, which is, I think, is in many ways most prevalent in the family business space. Because I'm walking into, so I'm feeling the external pressure of maybe being perceived as it's nepotism when I've worked damn hard to get here.
Exactly.
And my dad, mom, senior family member is holding me to a standard that may be much higher than they might hold another senior executive to. So, in many ways, imposter syndrome seems to me to be at its peak inside of the family business realm. It seems to be the greatest opportunity to have that going on. Talk to us about encountering that and how you see that show up in the family business. Is it what I just said, or is it someone else altogether?
Okay, so far be it from me to speak on behalf of everyone. I can speak on behalf of the stories that I've heard and my own experience, having been through imposter syndrome myself. Yeah. It's a incredibly destructive and very, very painful experience. I'll be very honest, like that. I think, you grow from very much once you move on from it, but in the moment itself is absolutely devastating.
Yeah.
I think for me, absolutely, the word expectations obviously plays a huge role in the family business context, right? Let's not forget that a family business as a definition is built on expectations from the outside, within, to the next generation. You grow up with an expectation that you should at least care a lot about the family business, right? You should at least be very interested, even if you actually want to be an actor or a singer or a songwriter, you should really care about the manufacturing of the tires that we're doing. And and you really should be invested emotionally. So I think that expectation, depending on what your character is like, right? And I speak to my sisters a lot about being an extrovert or an introvert in the family business. Or in the next generation, right? Being an operationally passive family member or an operationally active family member. All these things, all these multiple roles that intersect that we take on in the family business will lead to us feeling these expectations more explicitly or less so. right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you're in the family business, definitely, you're so right, Dov. There's definitely a sense of, I've had years of people basically telling me, well, you've had it easy. Your dad took care of you, basically, you becoming successful, or like whatever successful means, by the way. Like, I think no entrepreneur on the planet, by the way, is ever satisfied, just to be very clear. When people call me successful, I have no idea what they're talking about. Like,
Exactly,
you know what I mean? Because like, I think when
I
you're
don't
an
know what you're talking
entrepreneur,
about at all.
exactly. Like, when you're an entrepreneur, this is just so not something that you will ever come to, because it's the journey, right? Like, you're there for the fight. You're there. That's what matters to you. The success for you is that you get up every day and you do it, right? Like, that's it, really. But the fact is that in the beginning, of course, you care much more about what other people say.
Of course.
You care about the outside opinion, and you definitely care. You care a lot about the family's opinion. But I think it hurts very much when people, how should I put it? Like, it's not that they try and take away, I guess, like maybe they do, I'm not sure, but there's definitely a lot of negativity that comes your way with, oh, especially being a daughter, like, daddy's little girl, obviously, like, it's not possible for a woman to ever do anything on her own, God forbid, right? So I think like these things are definitely, and they put that kind of expectation, but then of course you fall into the trap, because essentially that expectations only exist within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you're doing this to yourself. Imposter syndrome is something that you do to yourself.
Absolutely.
This is not something that happens to you or that someone else can inflict upon you. You allow it, and then you experience it yourself. I fortunately got over it once I realized it was a thing. Like, you know what I mean? Like, with me, it happened. Like, I realized I snapped out of it when I realized, oh, this is actually not just me who feels this way. This is actually a thing. Like, imposter syndrome.
Oh, so you thought
exists.
It was just like you're the only imposter in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think a lot of people feel like that at the time.
They feel like that. And I'm just like, oh my God, Liz, I was so happy when I saw your article on LinkedIn about the imposter syndrome. I was like, yes, like, we really have to tell people, you know what, it's perfectly normal. There's a lot of people who feel the way that you do. And actually, when you're in a family business, this is also a big part of our mission in creating content around this, is like, you're not alone. Okay. You are definitely not alone with whatever, however crazy you think your family is. There's crazier out there, and then some, right? Like, so I think this is a very important message. But the imposter syndrome for me went away once I realized, well, it's a thing. It's a legitimate feeling to have, that other people have experienced as well. That brought in that relativity that you needed to snap out of it, and to realize that, what's really mean about being in that kind of vulnerable state for a while is that you start taking on the fears of other people.
Tell us about that.
You start not being able to discern anymore whether what you're afraid of is actually your own fear or the fear of others close to you. And because you're in that state of vulnerability and you don't trust yourself anymore, you start being afraid of things that you're actually not afraid of, which is a very weird sort of like paradox that you get into. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting to be afraid of things you're not afraid of, Dov, because you essentially have to pretend like you're scared of it, even though you're not. So coming to that recognition for me was very key, where I was like, okay, what exactly is it that you're so...
Ramya, that's really important. Let's just go to that from there, because that right there, I think we could spend another hour on that alone.
Yeah.
Just talk to us about that, because I wrote that I've written several pieces on imposter syndrome, and that latest piece that I wrote, which was about having compassion for the inner imposter, is important, because I don't think we're very compassionate about it at all. So I really want to sort of go down this path a little bit here, which is this idea that you're fearful of things you're not fearful of, that you're scared of other people's fears. Talk to us a little bit more about that, because I think there's something that people who are feeling a little bit crazy about this imposter syndrome inside of their own head need to hear. So thank you for bringing it up.
Well, and it's an important subject, right, Dov? And as I said, I'm extremely grateful people like yourself have taken it up as something that has to be discussed from many varied angles, because everyone experiences it differently. The way I see it is that when you have imposter syndrome, of course, inherently you become insecure about the most important thing, which is actually, what is it that you are currently, how do you value yourself? You yourself, right? Like, and how afraid are you of that valuation being the same, or there being a discrepancy of that valuation with the outside world, right? Like that's inherently it. Like imposter syndrome closes you in within yourself, where you might have an opinion about yourself, but you're so afraid of that opinion being the wrong one that, you know, you don't dare basically truly confront the outside world as who you really are. And I think for me, the key that I've seen with a lot of people was that in that moment of vulnerability where you actually forget how strong you are probably as well, and that you actually are doing a good job in a lot of things, maybe not the things that you thought you would, but in other areas, you become very vulnerable in a family business, particularly, to take on expectations and fears of other people. So this is especially strong, I feel like, when you're working with your parents. When you're working with your parents, because will always, I mean, point out one person in this world, Dov, that does not admit, if they're being really honest, to the fact that till their dying day, there will be a part of them wanting to please and satisfy their parents. It is almost impossible on a human level not to have that need somewhere hidden within you, even like, you know, to the very last, right? Like it's a tough thing sometimes for some people, depending on what kind of family you're born into. It's a lovely thing. In another family, it's a totally destructive thing.
Sure.
Because, you know, the parent doesn't appreciate it, or it's very dysfunctional. Now, what is important though, is for me to recognize was that at the end of the day, to snap out of imposter syndrome, I had to separate what it is that I was afraid of, and whether those fears were actually mine or whether they were the ones of the people I love around me. And I realized that about 90% of the fears of the things that I thought I was afraid of were actually the fears of others, family members and others that are close to me. Those are their expectations and their fears of rejection, and not mine. And also, those were their definition of success stuff. And that's a big one, isn't it? Like, especially as a woman who is now, like, we're the first generation where like this whole mixed workplace is an actual reality. Like, you know, we come in into a world that was assessed and structured by men, where success was defined by men. We haven't had the time yet to set our own benchmarks and to set our own definitions of what that means. So you know what I mean? So there was a lot of influences there as to saying like, okay, so imposter, of course you feel like an imposter, because by what freaking like factors are you supposed to even evaluate this in the first place, right?
Yeah, I mean, the imposter is based on many things, but one of those things, as you just said, is the framework. So, you know, and one of the things I love about it is, and where I've embraced it in my own life is, yes, I am an imposter in the context of the framework. So in the context of being an artist, Andy Warhol was an imposter. Yet, you know, unless you've got many millions of dollars to spare, you can't afford a Warhol, right? But there's an imposter. Now, the truth of the matter is he was actually a fine graphic artist, and most people don't know that. But if you look at his art, you go, you know, it's a Campbell soup can, come on, right? Because you don't understand. So oftentimes the people who are breaking the rules, the people who break out and do something else, are imposters in the context of the framework. So maybe being an imposter, and this is the way I've had to embrace it, is I am totally an imposter in the family business world. I didn't grow up in a family business. I never had $1 billion. I never knew anybody with $1 billion when I grew up. I knew people who were poor, very poor, you know, like poverty. So I'm an imposter in that world. And because I'm an imposter, I can see things you can't see. I'm an imposter in the leadership world. I never ran a Fortune 500 company, but I guide Fortune 500 leaders. So I'm an imposter? Yes. But Simon Cowell can't sing, and he's the best critic there is on the planet for hearing and recognizing the best in music. So sometimes what you're carrying as an imposter is actually not an imposter, but actually your ability to see things in a different framework. And that is the key.
Essentially what you're doing here is exactly that the thing with the imposter syndrome is you're the only one who can snap out of it. No one can get you out of it, because it's exactly how you frame it. It's exactly that. It's like if you decide to forever set other people's expectations as the benchmark as to whether you feel yourself as an imposter or not, you're going to lead a very unhappy life, and you're not going to be able to contribute to the family business. That's for sure. Because at some point, in order to really truly contribute to the family business, you're going to have to find your own groove. And you're going to have to find your own place, and you're going to have to find your particular special way to add value. And that might surprise others, and it might be out of the box, or it might be totally conform to expectations. It doesn't matter. The thing is, if that defines, if what other people defines, like how you perceive yourself, then whether that is an authentic thing for you to do, you will be dependent on that forever. And people fail you, of course, because people are humans too. Like my mother said something to me when I was growing up, which I thought was the solution. Two things that she said to me that I'll never forget. One is, Ramya, never forget, everyone that you see around you is just as much preoccupied with themselves as you are.
Mm-hmm.
So true, Mom. Thank you very much. She told me that when I was 11. Heavy conversation, but she's right. You know what I mean? When I was 14, my mother says the other thing to me that's totally absolved me of, like, you know, a lot of crises that people go through later in life. My mom, she quoted Kierkegaard to me. She said to me, the root of all evil lies in comparison.
Yes.
And this is, by the way, I'm not sure that's verbatim, but that's approximately what he said. And I think it's essentially so true. And it feeds into the imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is something that happens to you when the benchmark has been set on the outside for too long.
Yeah.
When you wait for that validation from the outside, and it'll never come, Dov. And you know, sometimes that's painful in a family business because you feel like, but guys, you're my family. How is it possible that you're not giving me what I need? And the problem is you're the only person who can. And to come to that conclusion can be a very painful journey for some people.
And particularly in a family business, because
yeah,
the whole psychological context of family is they provide me with what I need.
Yeah,
that is the psychological context. And so now if we put that in the framework of business and they can't, that's the thing that we've all got to deal with in life, not just in business. You know, we're gone way too long, and I just have loved this conversation.
So sorry.
You didn't nothing to go further, so it's a great combo. But we didn't, you know, one thing I do want to go into, just take a few minutes in before we close up, but, you know, you talked about finding your own path, even inside of a family business. And, you know, and oftentimes, you know, you're an immigrant family. You talked about that right at the beginning, which I think is the context for finding your own path very often. But also, your family business is not a magazine, but you have spearheaded that and become that, and you now have Thorough Work Magazine. And, you know, you and I talked about this when we first met. There's a little bit of insanity in that you've created a physical magazine in a digital age.
Don't.
But you've had enormous success with that. So talk to us about taking on this path that is controversial in the business sense, as in, you know, why the hell would you start a physical magazine in the digital world? And it was your path, not the way the family was going.
Okay, so thanks for that preamble too. Like, you know, it's good that someone else calls us crazy too, because it was like, so we
you
just
told
to give
me
the
that.
context. It's true, give the context. Like, you know, we started the print magazine in 2008.
Right.
At the beginning of a global recession, between the invention of the iPhone and the iPad, okay, when publishing was already seriously in disruption, with our family having zero background in publishing. And I always say hilarious in retrospect, right? Like, what on earth were we thinking? But I also think that, you know, this is typical family business hubris, because for some reason, entrepreneurial families, of course, we think we're the exception. Otherwise, we'd never do anything. You know what I mean? So we obviously very, very conceitedly believed that, like, you know, we had something special to offer here. And I think, like, you know, what really happened then was my parents, I think, were smart in the sense that they delegated tasks very clearly between my sisters and myself. So I was really put in charge of this. The tough thing was for me that within those 11 years, like, you know, the last 11 years, anyone who knows publishing knows what happened. Basically died. And now it's being sort of like resurrected in a very different way and shape or form and stuff like that. For some reason, I think because we were not a legacy publisher, we had the power and the insight to reinvent ourselves on time. And I think, you know, we did not have that trade-off thinking that a lot of people, of course, had. We did not have that attachment to the channel and the medium. We had an attachment to the content.
Right.
Look, like Thorough Work Magazine, whether it's print or online or voice, or whether it'll start appearing on the windshields of your car very soon with IoT, it doesn't matter to me. what matters to us is the storytelling. Matters to my family is that storytelling never goes away. And we want to provide content that make businesses last. That's our editorial vision. And we understood, fortunately, because we did, and honestly, I always say this, like, because we were so foolish, it was like, we did not have an issue with disruption, I guess. Like, you know what I mean? Because it was so out of the box anyways, what we did not have a problem staying out of that box. And I think that's why we survived. And that's why today we have millions of readers a year, like, because we just understood that there is no box anymore. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's no industry standard. There's no nothing. There's no one I can copy from. There is no precedent anymore. Right. And weirdly enough, depending on the family that you're part of, for my family, that worked out really well, because that's a little bit what we're like, because the way that we are, the combination that we represent, we're a bit like that as well. There is no precedent to what we're doing here. And I guess there was a good fit. And there also, I have to always say, like, timing is everything in these things, honestly. Like, I think, we just lucked out on a lot of things. I lucked out with my family in general, and then with this product as well. We're just deeply grateful that we get to do what we get to do.
Yeah, well, Ramya, this has been an amazing conversation. There's so many other areas I wanted to get into that we just didn't get time to. And because it was a great conversation, and that's always a good sign, is that there's always a lot left on the table that we could talk about, and maybe we'll be able to get back and do some more of that. But this was wonderful, and I want to thank you for it. Before we go, I would love for you to tell our viewers and our listeners where they can find out more about you, about your magazine, about your company, and about all the wonderful resources that you have, because I know you have a lot. So please share that.
Well, I mean, the magazine that we've been going on about most is one of the leading publications in the family business field. Is called Tharawat Magazines, www.tharawat-magazine.com. Maybe we might want to put a link in. Tharawat is an Arabic word, which not everyone knows how to spell.
What does it mean?
Word it means fortunes of life.
Ah.
So it's from Tharawat, and so that's part of the identity, of course, of our own identity as well, that we let flow in. We're very proud that it's made it into a global brand, in spite of the name, I would say, and people having trouble spelling it. So, and then we have another resource on that website. You'll also find our podcast called Family Business Voice, where we interview family business leaders and experts all over the world, amongst other stuff. We also have a specialized niche for women in family business. On womeninfamilybusiness.org, you will find content and a podcast that speaks about particularly the particular challenges and opportunities that women have within the family business context, an important conversation to have, I think, at this stage. And our global content studio, orbisterramedia.com, where you'll find out that we truly believe that companies can grow through content. And if you want to find out more about that, you can get in touch with us.
Okay, fabulous. Well, we'll make sure that the link for all of those is in the show notes so that people can grab those. They'll be on YouTube for you as well. And we'll make sure that all of those are there. It's been a pleasure and an honor having you on the show. I really enjoyed it, loved it. I gotta say, I always enjoyed my conversations with you, Ramya. Always such a great pleasure. Thank you so much. And for you, dear listener, remember, you can hang out with other conscious leaders and chat about this episode or any past episodes by going on to either our Facebook or our LinkedIn pages and look for the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast. If you just look for Leadership and Loyalty Podcast, you'll be able to go there and chat with other conscious leaders about this subject. And to find out more about hiring me, Dov Marin, as a speaker or strategist for your organization, simply go to fullmontyleadership.com. fullmontyleadership.com/consulting or fullmontyleadership.com/speaking. The research consistently shows that the fastest growing companies face the same challenges you do. If you're frustrated with investing in training and developing your talent, only have them leave before you get your ROI, then come talk to us at fullmontyleadership.com, where we provide the essential leadership skills to rekindle and amplify the hidden loyalty assets inside of your company by tapping into purpose. fullmontyleadership.com, because you can't outsource authenticity. I want to thank you for sharing the show with everybody you know. Till next time, stay curious, my friend. Stay curious about how you perceive family business, whether you're inside it or outside it, and what the biases are that you're holding that may be limiting you, and how indeed that is impacting things like imposter syndrome. Because remember, as Ramya has just said, it's all about how you have framed it. Step outside of everybody else's perception of you and create an image of all the value you can bring. Your stories matter. If you don't believe me, go check out tharawat.com magazine. You'll find out all kinds of things about the great family stories right there. I'm Dov Barron. I'm here to assist you tapping into your deep greatness to reach that next level of focus, clarity, purpose, and profit in your business, your life, and your leadership impact. And I am out.